Hello everyone, I hope everybody is doing well. Somebody have requested the following video. This is part 3 of chapter 11, mechanical ventilation. And please forgive me if I make a mistake, or you can leave a comment below correcting the mistake that I made. And we will continue from where we left off. And where we left off, we were talking about the tidal volume, and we were explaining what it is and how does it relate. I explained this one on the first video, so I will move on here. So pressure difference during breathing. A pressure gradient is needed to achieve gas flow from one place to another. Using the equation of motion, we can recognize the pressure gradients of differences in pressure between 2 points in space in each of the components of the model. The components of the model airway, lung, and chest wall are defined. So we have the flow, and they're saying here a pressure gradient is needed to achieve gas flow from one place to another. Using the equation of motion, we can recognize the pressure gradients or differences in pressure between 2 points in space. With that being said, is that we have two pressures like I drew here. We have a pressure of 5 and we have a pressure of 7. So the gradient, of course, from higher pressure to the lower pressure, that's the direction of flow of air. So what they're explaining here, if you have a pressure here of 5 and the pressure here is 2, so the gas flow will be going down this way. So once this gradient, the gas goes into the lung after the pressure is low here. Let's say this pressure increases to 7 and the pressure here is 5. Now the air is gonna go up to the upper airways and escape, and that's the exhalation phase. So those all the pressure gradients that we can move on to the second page and see as what we can find here. As everything that exists between these points in space, let's define each of these pressure gradients. The respiratory system is everything that exists between pressure measured at the airway opening, which is at your mouth or nose, and the pressure measured at the body surface area, body surface. The pressure difference in the pressure differences is called the transrespiratory pressure. So the two different pressures between the airway and the body surface is called transrespiratory pressure. The term PAO comes from the term PBS in the equation. This order is dedicated by the direction of flow. So the order of this here because of the direction of airflow, correct? So we have the airway opening and we have the body surface area. Or you could say the alveolar pressure, as they pointed out here. And they also have a table here for us to understand it, which has made it much easier. Pressure differences using in describing respiratory system mechanics. So those pressure gradients, you will need to understand them more than just memorizing them. Because if you understand it, you will not need to memorize any of them because it is so easy when you understand it. So let's continue and we try to clarify as much as I can. The term PAO comes from the term PBS in the equation. This order is dedicated by the equation of flow. For inspiration, PAO is higher than PBS, and PTR is calculated by subtracting body surface area, body surface pressure from the PAO, which is alveolar airway pressure. The airway opening. The same general principle applies to all other pressure differences describing subsequently. The components of transrespiratory pressure correspond to all the components of the graphic model: airways, lungs, and chest wall. We can further divide these components in their pressure gradients, starting at the airways in the model, The airways are whatever exists between pressure measured at the airway opening excuse me, and pressure measured in the alveoli of the lungs. The graphic model makes the lungs look like a giant alveolus, which means that the alveolar pressure represents an average pressure over all alveoli in real lungs. The pressure difference is calculated as transrespiratory pressure. This is a very important pressure. Thus, trans-airway pressure represents all the airways, real and artificial. The alveolar region is whatever exists between pressure measured in the alveolus and pressure measured in the pleural space. The associated pressure difference is transalveolar pressure. The PTA represents all the alveoli as if they were on a single alveolus. We also take into account that the chest wall exists between pressure measured in the pleural space and the pressure on the body surface. The pressure difference is called a trans-chest wall pressure. It will come very clear once we move on. And if we can go back to this diagram here, this makes it very easy and simple. There are many pressures here. So they're saying there's a pressure, this is the lung. There's a pressure here, which is between the pleural space and this is the pleural space. So this is a pressure here. And there's also a pressure between here and here, which is body surface area here, right? Which is like the chest wall area. And then there's also a pressure between here and here. That's another pressure, and then pressure from here to here, and then there's a pressure from here all the way to the outside. So if you go back to the previous video, you will understand I described this nicely in the other video, the previous one that I've made. So as of now, we will just continue reading, and it will get easier because I don't want to spend too much time on these pressures. There are much more to understand on the following. Okay. So some of these components can be combined to encompass structure that are of a clinical importance. One of the most used combinations join the airway in the alveolar region PTA as assist the pulmonary system, and this is called pulmonary pressure difference. What may be confusing is that there are other definitions of transpulmonary pressure in the literature. Some authors defined trans-airway pressure as alveolar pressure minus pleural pressure. The confusion arises from the fact that trans-airway pressure PAA minus PPL, but only under static conditions, which is different than what we're thinking. Static conditions can be imposed during mechanical ventilation by using an inspiratory or expiratory hold maneuver. This situation should be considered a special case of trans-airway pressure. However, the general case is trans-airway, which shows that the pressure must be measured to drive mechanical properties of pulmonary system under either static or dynamic breathing conditions. If we want to elevate the elastance and resistance of the pulmonary system, we substitute trans-airway pressure for P in the equation of motion. Alternatively, if we want to evaluate the total respiratory system elastance and resistance, we substitute trans-airway pressure for P. Sometimes it may be useful to determine the pressure required to expand the lung and chest wall components. To do this, we use the transthoracic pressure difference, which is defined as follows. We use the transrespiratory pressure gradient and the other gradients to understand the gas flow into and out of the alveoli during breathing. Table 11-2. So they're sending us to this table here. So table 11-2 summarizes these equations. For a spontaneously breathing person, person who's breathing without any help from a mechanical machine, from mechanical ventilator. Spontaneously breathing, like me right now. I am spontaneously breathing right now. The airway pressure is, or alveolar pressure, is subatmospheric in the beginning of inspiration, compared with PaO, causing air to flow into the alveoli. The opposite happens in the beginning of exhalation. Okay, so we have a very important point here that we have to understand. So let's write this down so we can understand what are they trying to tell us here. So they are saying here, okay, we use the respiratory pressure gradient and the other gradients to understand the gas flow into out of the alveoli, okay? These questions, okay, for spontaneously breathing person. So this is a normal breathing person. We're not on a mechanical ventilator, okay? So we have to understand that what we're gonna do here is spontaneously breathing. Okay. PA is, we said, is alveolar pressure. So we can go, so where were we? If you see that PA, as you see here in this diagram, PA is pointing right over here. So this is what? Alveolar pressure. So we have an understanding. So now you understand what's PA. PA is alveolar pressure. So pressure in your lung. So you don't have to get it confused that where is this pressure coming from. It's just the pressure inside your lung. So let's draw a lung here. This is a terrible drawing. I'm just tired anyway. So PA, which is just your lung. So this is the pressure inside your lung, okay? So PA is subatmospheric in the beginning of inspiration compared with PaO. So PaO will be here, PaO. This is airway, open airway pressure. So this is at your mouth and nose. Right here is mouth and nose, correct? And nose, right? So they're saying it's subatmospheric here. And when is that subatmospheric? So the pressure here is subatmospheric at start of inspiration. Okay, so what they're saying here in this paragraph is they're saying this sentence: alveolar pressure in your lung before you inhale, right? At the start of inhalation, when you take the deep breath in, when you first inhale, when the air goes in, the pressure here is subatmospheric, which means it's below atmospheric. Thus we have a pressure gradient that what causes flow of air to go in your lungs, correct? So atmospheric pressure, okay, so now let's go back to defining subatmospheric and atmospheric. So atmospheric pressure is about 760 right now, millimeters of mercury. This is atmospheric pressure. Subatmospheric is below it. So in order for the air to go into our lung, when we first inhale, at the beginning of inhalation, the pressure in your lung is lower than the pressure at your mouth and nose. So I'll give you an example. If the pressure is 760 here of millimeters of mercury, here it must be at least 756. So there's a number of 4, a pressure decrease of 4 here in your lung. So this will cause the air to flow down. Because remember what we said, pressure, if we go here, pressure gradient is the flow of air from the highest pressure to the lowest pressure. So therefore, since we are the pressure at the beginning, at the start of inspiration, taking the air in, for you to take the air in to go into your lung, the pressure here is lower than the pressure at your mouth, and that's what causes air to flow into your lung. So there's a pressure gradient between your mouth and your lung. So let's continue reading. Alveolar is subatmospheric in the beginning of inspiration compared with PaO. So comparing it to pressure at your mouth, it is subatmospheric during inspiration, causing air to flow into the alveoli. So this is the main cause of it, is that pressure gradient. The opposite happens in the beginning of exhalation. And guess what? The opposite happens here when you want to blow the air out. Exhalation, when you exhale, right? Because if you inhale, you have to exhale, correct? When you take the breath in, the breath must come out. So what happens is the pressure here builds up. So the pressure here during exhalation go up. So if it is 7, it was 50, so let's say that it has to be, there's a little balance between them. So when 760 is here, here's now the pressure for the exhalation to happen. The pressure here is higher. So the pressure must be here more than 760. So let's say 66 for the air to go up, because atmospheric pressure now is 760 and it will always be 760. Depends on what location you are in the world. But this is what happens. So the pressure builds up in your lung, and then the air goes up and you exhale. Alveolar pressure is higher than PaO, causing air to flow out of the airway opening. During a normal breath cycle, the glottis remains open. This is important. So your glottis remains open. Okay, so for you to understand what is the glottis is, like this is the airway opening of the trachea, right? Then you have the vocal cords. Oh, this is a bad drawing. The vocal cords, right? So this is your trachea. The glottis is the space between the vocal cords. This is the glottis, is the name of the space between them. So if this is your trachea, if this is the opening, right? So those are the vocal cords. This is your trachea. This space here that you can see, only the space is called the glottis. So they're saying during during a normal breathing cycle. Breathing cycle means you're sitting comfortably, you're not running, you're not singing, you're not doing anything. Normal breathing cycle, you're in and out. Your glottis, that space remains open. So it's open, okay? So there's only pressures that rides it for the air to go in and out. The body surface pressure and the opening airway pressure remains at 0. So the two pressures, the body surface area and the pressures at your mouth, remain 0. Atmospheric, which is 0, adds in centimeters of water, it will be compared to 760 millimeters of mercury. This is what they're talking about here. Throughout the cycle, only changes in alveolar and pleural are of the interest. So alveolar pressure and pleural pressure are of the interest right now when you are normally breathing. It is often helpful to use these to describe the changes in pressures during breathing cycle. So now we're gonna move on to pleural pressure and alveolar pressure. So before inspiration, pleural pressure is approximately -5 centimeters of water. So now we're gonna be a big move here. We're gonna forget about, okay, so we can move on. Let me explain it better. Now let's make another lung. Now, this is your lung, right? This is the alveoli. This is the lung. Here, that space, this is the chest wall. Pleural pressure is here. Correct? This is here, between here. Now, what they're saying is, before inspiration, pleural pressure is approximately -5. So here is approximately -5 centimeters of water. Below atmospheric. So here is 5 at least below atmospheric. Atmospheric, we said, is 760, so it is at least 755, correct? Here, in the pleural, between your lung, this is your lung, and this is the chest wall. So between, this is pleural pressure here, it is 760 below, 755, which is -5 centimeters of water below atmospheric, or it could be more than that if you compare millimeters of mercury, or, but we're not gonna go into that. Okay, pleural pressure is approximately negative. Okay, and alveolar pressure is 0 centimeters of water. So in here it is 0, correct? And here is -5, so it's below atmospheric, or 0. Okay. And alveolar pressure is 0. The transpulmonary pressure gradient is also approximately 5 in the resting state. That is transairway. Okay, now you see that they pull in the formula and they plug it in. This positive end expiratory remains the lung at its resting volume. This positive end expiratory, so that pressure that is here between the lung and the pleural space, that's what keeps the lung airway open. Okay, this positive and end expiratory maintaining the lung at its resting volume, functional residual capacity. Airway opening and alveolar pressure are 0. So the airway pressure gradient also is 0. No gas move in and out of the respiratory tract. Okay. Inspiration begins when muscular effort expands the thoracic. Expansion causes a decrease in pleural pressure. This decrease in pleural pressure causes a positive change to transalveolar and pressure and alveolar pressure, which includes flow into the lungs. The inspiratory flow is proportional to the positive change in pressure differences. The higher the change in transalveolar pressure, the higher is the flow. So this is your body from the side, okay? And then you have your ribs, right? When the ribs flare out and they expand your chest, when you breathe, take a deep breath. When that muscle causes that flare, that opens up and drops the pressure. So when the pressure is dropped in the pleural space, it is increased in the alveolar space, it is decreased, and then the air flows in. So it has to do with the, let's see if they have pictures. So we'll continue. We'll clear it off more as we go along. Before inspiration, pleural pressure is approximately -5 centimeters of H2O below trends. Okay, now inspiration begins when muscular effort expands the thoracic. When the muscular effort expands your chest cavity. Thoracic expansion causes a decrease in pleural pressure. So we already said that pressure decrease. This decrease in pleural pressure causes positive change to trans pressure and to alveolar pressure, which includes flow into the lungs. So this is that pressure changes causes the air go into your lung. The inspiration flow is proportional to the positive change in trans airway pressure. That means if the change is higher, there's going to be more air going into your lungs. If the change is just slightly, it will go less air. Okay. The higher the change in trans, the higher is the flow. Okay. Pleural pressure continues to decrease until the end of inspiration. So it's a continuous decrease in pleural pressure during inspiration. After you end inspiration, alveolar filling slows when alveolar pressure approaches equilibrium with the atmospheric. And so they're saying when there's an equilibrium, so if alveolar pressure, if atmospheric is 760, alveolar pressure is 755. When you expand your chest, right? When chest expansion happens, between the pleural space is what the number decreases. This has to go up, so the pressure here will increase, correct? Once it becomes equilibrium with atmospheric, once it becomes at 760, now inspiration will end, and then this might go slightly a little higher than atmospheric, or the recoil of your chest cavity in the lungs, and then the air pushes out. So that recoil, this is what moves the air. Alveolar filling slows when alveolar pressure approaches equilibrium with the atmospheric, and inspiratory flow decreases to 0. Okay. At this point, called end inspiration, alveolar pressure has returned to 0, and the intrapleural pressure and hence transpulmonary pressure gradient reaches the maximal value for normal breath of approximately 10 centimeters of H2O. At end inspiration, the muscle pressure relaxes, and now alveolar pressure is higher than pressure at the airway opening. Driving flow, this is what I just said before. Now the airway opening, driving flow, and okay. Now alveolar pressure is higher than pressure at the airway opening. So the alveolar pressure, the pressure in your lung now is higher than the pressure at the airway opening at your mouth and nose. Now the air is gonna go what? It's gonna go out. Driving flow in expiratory direction. The equation of motion shows this, setting the driving pressure to 0. So this is the equation of motion. Some of it, not all of it, but they're explained here: elastance, volume, resistance, and flow. This equation says two important things. Number one, this flow is negative, indicating expiration, and 2, the driving force transthoracic pressure equal to elastance times volume. For expiratory flow is the energy stored in the combined elastance of lungs and chest wall. The total elastance is the sum of the chest wall and lung elastance. These events occur during normal total volume exertion. Similar pressure change combined deeper inspiration and expiration. The magnitude of the pressure changes is greater with deeper breathing. Pleural pressures are always negative, subatmospheric. This is important. Pleural pressures are always negative, subatmospheric. So the pleural pressure is always below atmospheric, and that's what's helping us the drive of breathing in and out during normal inspiration and exhalation. So you have to really understand this. During forced inspiration with a big downward movement of the diaphragm, the pleural pressure can decrease to -50. Whereas during forced expiration, pleural pressure may increase above atmospheric pressure to 15 to 100 centimeters of water. Force opposing inflation of the lung. The lungs have a tendency to recoil inward, whereas the chest wall tends to move outward. These opposing forces keep the lung at its resting volume. To generate the previously described pressure gradients, the lungs must be distended. This distension requires several opposing forces to be overcome for inspiration to occur. As indicated in the equation of motion, a force opposing lung inflation may be grouped into two categories: elastic force and frictional force. Elastic force involves the tissue of the lungs, thoracic and abdomen, along with the surface tension in the alveoli. Fractional forces include resistance caused by gas flow through the airways, natural and artificial, and tissue movement during breathing.